and smooth over again. Thank everybody for coming and joining us today, whether you're locally here in the Point Reyes area, other parts of California, other parts of the country, or even further afield. Patty and I have discovered in the last several weeks that being in nature at this difficult time is extremely important. It's an important way to reduce our stress level and to keep focused on important things in life. And here in Point Reyes, we, yeah, one moment, please. At Point Reyes, while the access has been limited to a fair amount of our area, we still have some wonderful resources that we have available to us. And we're just getting our share screen in the bottom. Okay, I think that's going to be better now. So again, some people I know, we're just going to hold on for a moment here. And some of you are not from the area and need a map of the local area. Point Reyes is about a little bit more than an hour north of San Francisco, but it's actually within a 2-hour drive of 6 or 7 million people. And what that means is that many people come out here any day of the year. It's not restricted to summer visitation like other national parks like Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone National Park. We have a tremendous variety of wildlife here. Almost 500 species of birds have been seen in the park, more than any other national park in the country. About 70 species of mammals and about 1,000 species of plants. So tremendous biodiversity in 70,000 acres, a relatively small area. And we're very fortunate that there was a lot of hard work done way back in the 1960s and 1970s to preserve this landscape and others in West Marin for us to enjoy and take advantage of now. So what I'd like to do with you is to share a biking and walking adventure that I had last week to find a good number of birds. Specifically, I did it last Wednesday, which happened to be Earth Day, and that was not necessarily an accident. I actually was at the first Earth Day. And I remember as a somewhat naive 16-year-old kid growing up in New York City, I had only recently discovered nature and the outdoors, and of course, threats to our different ecosystems. So it was a real eye-opening experience for me. 10 years later, I moved to Point Reyes to work as a naturalist, and I fell in love with the area as far as the diversity of landscapes and the tremendous number of birds and other wildlife that are here. So the reality is not just spring, but even in the middle of the winter, there are many, many birds one could see here. Over 200 species of birds can be found here, even in the middle of the winter, which is more than most parts of the country, whether it's birds like the Steller's jay on the left or the California scrub jay on the right, or chestnut-backed chickadee, or the bush tit. These are all birds that we have with us every day of the year. When I say the word spring, that conjures up different meanings depending on where people maybe are living. When I used to live in New England many years ago, spring might not be coming until mid-April or even later. But here in coastal California, we're pretty spoiled. Even in January and mid to late January, when the pink flowering currant starts to bloom, that's a signal that some birds may be migrating. And one of the first birds that we see as far as a spring arrival would be the Allen's hummingbird. This is a beautiful male. Females, of course, are not so distinctive. The Allen's hummingbird spends half the year in West Mexico, and it comes up here, as I mentioned, in late January, early February, and very quickly They start to establish breeding territories, and by July, that's all over, and head on back down to Mexico. A few weeks later, by February, many swallows have started to arrive back. Tree swallow would be this one, followed by the violet green swallow and other species. A month later, in mid-March, we're often graced by the presence of this beautiful migrating warbler, the Wilson's warbler. March 16th is a date that stands out for me. On March 16th of many years, I hear or see a Wilson's warbler near our house, or I have. So there's some very precise routine to this particular species as far as their migratory behaviors and pathways. And that's very interesting for a number of these birds, how they are determined. They have clocks in their brain, and typically it's increasing daylight that hastens a migratory change in them as far as when they begin to migrate. So I began my day at 5:45 in the morning, and this is what I heard. And that, for some of you, may recognize that. It sounds a little bit like a robin, but a little bit more hoarse. And it's the call of this neotropical migrant with a very large bill. So we call it a grosbeak. Specifically, the black-headed grosbeak is often the first bird that we hear singing at 5:30 or slightly later in the morning. And that was followed shortly by a spotted towhee and other birds as well. As I got my clothes on and started and had breakfast, I started to enjoy the view from our deck and heard at least 10 species of birds singing or calling in what birders refer to as the dawn chorus. If you haven't had a chance to experience that for yourself, I would certainly encourage you to get out before dawn when it's probably fairly quiet, and then to enjoy how one bird starts to call, and then a second, and then probably, depending on where you might be, what part of the country, you might have many, many birds that are all calling. It would have been great to stay there on the deck and enjoy that more, but I had many miles to go. It was about 6:45 in the morning when I biked down the driveway over to Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. Every few feet, I was hearing another bird singing or calling, such as the wren tit, or this one here, which is the orange crown warbler, mostly a mustard colored bird, that the males sometimes show this pale orange color on the cap. I biked behind the Inverness Park Market and was very thrilled to hear a bird song that I hadn't heard since last summer. I'll play that one for you. That, of course, is the song of the Swainson's thrush, and that is one of our moderately common nesting birds in the area. But that day, April 22nd, was the first day that I had heard one, signaling that these birds had recently arrived. So bird watchers have an expression or an acronym FOS, which stands for first of the season. And that was the first day that I heard the beautiful song of this thrush. We do have a different thrush, the hermit thrush, which spends the winter with us, but in most parts of the Bay Area in the breeding season, it is the Swainson's thrush that we hear. Well, I kept biking on, heard other songs like the Pacific slope flycatcher pictured here, and a warbling vireo, which has a less distinct song. My destination was a freshwater wetland marsh called Olema Marsh. And of course, different habitats will have different wildlife, different birds living in that specific area. And my target species here was a bird that a former mentor of mine, Rich Dahlcup, described as sounding like old men laughing at a poker game. So you can tell me if you think their call sounds like that. So that sound, of course, is from the Virginia rail. Again, a bird that we hear much more often than see in various wetland, mostly freshwater marshes, a little bit in salt marshes as well. As I listened, I heard other birds from that habitat, the Marsh Wren, and also this one, the common yellowthroat, which is a type of warbler. I kept biking on to the Limentor Road and was happy to hear several purple finches singing off in the distance. Probably not the best named birds, mostly a rosy pinkish red on the head color. It looks a little bit like a house finch, but doesn't have streaks on the belly like that other bird. And I also heard several California quail calling with their distinctive calls. Sounds a little bit like the word Chicago, more of a mnemonic device. Somewhat like that. Don't have a recording of that one. I biked on towards the base of the ridge. The tall Douglas fir conifers there form a specific habitat. And as I stood there, I heard another FOS, this particular song. And bird watchers have the mnemonic device for this particular bird, which is whip 3 beers, or what peas you. As some of you know that one, the olive-sided flycatcher. The olive-sided flycatcher, of course, is a neotropical migrant. They migrate all the way down to the Andes in South America, where they spend the winter. And research has shown that their numbers have declined quite a bit now in North America, probably as a result of habitat destruction on their wintering grounds in South America. But I was thrilled to hear that one. It was the first day of the spring that I heard it. And I kept biking on and heard another bird, which I've been hearing for a while earlier in the spring and into the winter. And I always like the Latin name of that bird, the genus that is, as it translates into cave dweller. So the Latin name is Troglodytes pacifica, which is named for the Pacific wren. They inhabit shaded or moist places. So that's where this bird gets its Latin name. We'll just listen to its beautiful long call. The song, I think, is a bigger deal than this little brown bird itself. And certainly when we hear certain sounds, I'm sure it's just like different pieces of music. When you hear, if you're into classical music and hear a specific cut of music, or obviously any other type of music that evokes a certain emotional response from you. And it's certainly the same way when I hear that particular bird. Well, I biked on to the Bear Valley part of Point Reyes National Seashore. And this is a place that on a normal weekday might have school groups of 5th and 6th graders enjoying the wildlife here, or on a weekend, hundreds and hundreds of people starting their hikes at this major trailhead. It was extremely eerie to be the only person here. But there were birds, certainly, and I enjoyed seeing several western bluebirds sitting on the fences and flying around. And then I was even more thrilled to hear and see several purple martins flying overhead. Martins, of course, are large swallows. They're much more common in the eastern part of the country than they are in parts of California. Typically, they nest in tree cavities. And a lot of our cavities in this area are occupied by a non-native invasive bird called the European starling. And again, if the bluebirds in other parts of the country here as well, and the martins cannot find suitable nesting habitat, if these cavities are occupied, that will certainly negatively impact their nesting success. Again, Bear Valley has a wonderful mixture of different habitats: open grasslands, woodlands, and oak woodland. And we have a bird called the Hutton's vireo that can be found in this area any day of the year. It's a permanent resident species compared to this one that looks very similar, the ruby-crowned kinglet, which spends the non-breeding season here. So when we refer to winter here for birds, winter might mean late September through early April or so. That's the period when we see ruby-crowned kinglets in the area. It's quite a common to abundant bird. On this day, I only saw one ruby-crowned kinglet, but heard and saw Hutton's vireos every few hundred meters or so. If you were up early here, you might have gotten into this beautiful Douglas fir primeval, that's maybe not a good word to use, but old growth forest, because there never has been a whole lot of logging of the Douglas fir habitat in this national park. If you were up early, which I had been up early, but before dawn, you might have heard an owl in this area, which I did not, but I'm just sharing because they are so wonderful. The great horned owl tends to be our most commonly heard species, but this is also a place where the northern spotted owl nests, and in fact, Point Reyes and western part of Marin County has the highest nesting density of northern spotted owls of anywhere in their range. And this is the southernmost part of their breeding range that extends up to the Pacific Northwest. But these forests are particularly good habitat for many different species of woodpecker. There are 6 different species of woodpecker that nest in the area, from the fairly common hairy woodpecker to the very similar downy woodpecker. Downy woodpeckers have a smaller bill and a different sound. And sometimes one can see the black marks on the white outer tail feathers of the smaller downy woodpecker as well. Another woodpecker that we have, really the most iconic one, is the Acorn Woodpecker, and I just want to play this video for you. So this Acorn Woodpecker is very a charismatic bird. This happens to be a male. It goes from a white forehead to red forehead. And they are quite unusual in terms of living in bands of 10 to 12 individuals. There are certain birds that tend to the foraging activities where they take acorns off oak trees and then store them in the holes of that they make in the sides, in this case of a dead Douglas fir tree, and then that is called a granary tree, just like the Native Americans who lived in this area. The Miwoks would have made granaries as well. They live in a female-dominated society, and the females have to figure out which is the alpha female, and after laying her eggs, the other females will help to incubate and raise the chick. So it's you could spend a whole presentation just on acorn woodpeckers. But again, if you come to Bear Valley, I'd say you're almost guaranteed to hear and see some there. It's a good place for raptors. We have red-tailed hawk as pictured here, and the much smaller falcon and American kestrel that both nest in the area. And I saw both of them as I was looking up into the tall Douglas fir trees. Most people probably don't get too excited when they see or hear the word sparrow, but we do have some colorful sparrows in the area, including this one, the golden crowned sparrow, which is a fairly common bird in people's backyards and shrubby habitat, showing up in late September or so, with us through the fall and winter until about now, when they're leaving to migrate up to British Columbia and Alaska, where they nest. So I was glad to hear and see several golden crowned sparrows, as well as only one white crowned sparrow. The white crowned sparrow is another bird that tends to be fairly common in people's backyards and parks. And now they are leaving to migrate up to higher latitudes. up in Alaska or Canada and higher elevation areas, although we do have a unusual small non-migratory population that breeds in our fog belt along the coast here in central California. And the most common sparrow we have in the area here is the song sparrow with its streaked breast, different than these other two sparrows. And as I biked along, almost again every few hundred meters, I was hearing another song sparrow. A fairly common bird in this area is the mourning dove, although some people suggest that it's becoming less common as we have competition from another non-native species, the Eurasian collared dove, which is now occupying large parts of California and large parts of the country. But we do have a native pigeon, which is quite beautiful, and that is the BandTailed pigeon. The BandTailed pigeon feeds primarily on acorns and berries, and as such is fairly nomadic, moving around from one food source to the other. Some years they're hard to find, and other years they're quite plentiful and relatively easy to find or hear. And this year is one of those latter. Every few hours, it seems, where we live, and I spend a lot of time I'm hearing and seeing BandTailed pigeon. Well, I wanted to see more evidence of spring migration, so I biked up the hill above the town of Olema up to an area called Bolinas Ridge, where there's a beautiful grasslands, and I saw a sparrow called the Savannah sparrow, which does nest in the grasslands here, and another inhabitant of the open grasslands, Western meadowlark. I'm sorry, I don't have a song of Western meadowlark for you folks, but some people think it's very evocative of the American West, although their nesting range takes them all the way over to the Midwest portion of the country. I biked down the other side of this ridge down to a grove of redwood trees. There wasn't a huge amount of activity in the area here, but I was happy to see and hear at least one brown creeper creeping up and down trunk of the conifers here. And then I moved over to a road that I don't go to all that often. I think one phenomenon I've been hearing a lot about is that many people, as we're sheltering in place, are discovering in greater detail local parks or walking in our neighborhoods and discovering literally our backyard to an intimate degree that we never did before. So over the years, I've driven this road, but rarely have I biked it, or certainly never walked the whole length of it. It's a beautiful landscape of grassland to the right side with the riparian habitat along Lagunitas Creek to the left. I saw a small brown bird fly up to the top of the fence here, and I knew what it was pretty much before I looked at it, but I was thrilled to see one of the more handsome sparrows that we do get to see in the area of the Lark Sparrow. Lark sparrows are named for their singing ability. Some birds will sing as they're falling down towards the ground. And a group of birds that do that particularly are larks, which we don't have too many here of in North America, but the lark sparrow does that particular behavior, and that's where it gets its name. Certainly one of the more beautiful sparrows that we have in California, if not all of North America. Well, I kept biking on, looking for more evidence of spring migration. Again, the creek bed off to the left is Lagunitas Creek that starts on the top of Mount Tamalpais and flows across the county, ending in Tomales Bay. There's a very nice collection of willow trees and maples and ash. Here it's a nice view looking towards Black Mountain, or what some locals refer to as Knuckle Mountain. And at this point, I heard another FOS, first of the season, and then saw it, and that was the Western Wood Pewee. Western Wood Pewees are another neotropical migrant, but where they nest is actually quite a large range from southern Mexico as far south as Nicaragua, all the way up to southeast Alaska. It's a very large range for this particular species. And very soon after that, I heard a different flycatcher breed, singing. And that was a voice, again, I hadn't heard since last summer, an old friend, the Ashthroated Flycatcher. Some people say that it sounds like an old policeman's whistle. So I'll let you be the judge of that. But flycatchers are a group of birds, like a lot of things that we pursue. The more you learn, the more there is to know. So there are different kinds of flycatchers. The first one I showed in the beginning, the Pacific slope flycatcher, is in a different groups than the peewees here. And this Ashthroated flycatcher is in a group called the Myarchus flycatchers, of which we have many, particularly in the tropics if you travel down in Central or South America. Well, I continued biking along. I saw quite a few yellow birds. Yellow seems to be a color more so than blue or red that a lot of birds have. And this was the American goldfinch. We do have a pretty good number of American goldfinches in the area that I was hearing and seeing, but a smaller number of lesser goldfinch. Then I biked on to the town of Point Reyes Station. On the edge is a former dairy area where milking cows were in the area up until 2008. And we have had a very wonderful restoration project sponsored by a local organization called the Point Reyes National Seashore Association to restore 500 acres of former diked off pasture lands to a very thriving ecosystem where quite a number of water birds spend the winter, migrate through, and nest here as well. So shortly after I got to the edge of this marsh, I was quite happy to see a raptor, the male northern harrier, flying by. The particular one I saw was not carrying a prey item like here. They do feed on a variety of rodents and birds as well. No matter how much I looked, I could not find another bird, another raptor that nests in the area. That's the white-tailed kite. But I did see quite a few sandpipers. This particular species is called the greater Yellowlegs, and it certainly lives up to its name for a distinctive colorful leg pattern. Most of the ducks have passed on, have migrated through the area, but I did see a few. I also saw a kingfisher flying overhead. This happens to be the female belted kingfisher. A friend of mine used to call them queenfishers. The female kingfisher has this brown wash, which the males lack. But I did see a few cinnamon teal in this marsh. Of course, the males are quite handsome, this coloration, as well as a number of green-winged teal as well. And then I kept biking back towards the little town of Inverness Park. The wires along the road here are usually very predictable spot for the red-shouldered hawk. This could almost be called a red-bellied hawk, and some people feel that because it has a separate breeding range from other red-shouldered hawks in other parts of the country and other factors that it could actually be a different species. But certainly the adults with their orangey red shoulders and belly and black and white primaries and tail are quite striking birds. A less expected raptor that flew in and landed on the wire was a Cooper's hawk. We do have an occasional Cooper's hawk in the area, but we don't always see them perched on wires. This one sat for about 15 seconds looking down for, I'm sure, its next meal, and then moved on. So the wires near the Inverness Park market are often a good place to see another neotropical migrant, the barn swallow. Barn swallows are a fairly common breeding species in most parts of North America, but migrate down to the tropics as far south as South America. For the most part, we don't have them in the winter here, although it seems each winter we are seeing more and more individual barn swallows in the area. Whether that's a result of global warming is hard to assess, but we'll certainly keep focused on that one. They do make their cup-shaped nest under the sides, on the sides of the building here, so it's usually a pretty reliable place to see this one. Well, this was a pretty civilized biking expedition, so I went home to have a bit of lunch, and our deck overlooks the Giacometti wetlands, and during lunch I scoped out a flock of sandpipers that was flying off in the distance. And even though they were quite small, I could make them out as the least sandpiper, which actually is the smallest sandpiper in North America. But it was time to head out for another few hours for a walk to the town of Inverness on the side of Tomales Bay. Before I got down to the bottom of the driveway, I heard another wonderful sound, which I'm sure some of you have heard in your travels. And that is people describe it as sounding maniacal or laughing, yodel-like sound. I looked up and was fortunate to see a pileated woodpecker flying by and landing on a bay tree nearby. So again, that's the kind of bird you never get tired of seeing. I would have been happy just to hear it, but to see it as well. They're really tied in with mature woodlands, and although they are fairly large birds, almost the size of a crow, they can be fairly shy in their behavior. Well, I walked down along the main road, Sir Francis Drake Boulevard, and got to the town of Inverness, which if you were to blink, you might miss entirely. And some of you know this spot behind the general store. There's a very iconic old boat that's been beached there for quite a while. Tomales Bay is extremely important habitat for migratory waterfowl and shorebirds, and also an extremely important wintering area for a large number of birds as well. There were a number of great egrets in the area. Great egrets nest in the area, but the smaller white species of egret, the snowy egret, does not nest in this part of Marin County. They primarily nest in different areas around San Francisco Bay. So there were fewer snowy egrets on that day, but I was also pleased to see a number of double-crested cormorants off on a mudflat. We do have one island called Hog Island in Tomales Bay where several hundred double-crested cormorants nest. Though we do have two other species of cormorants, but they're not in the bay very much. They nest primarily out on the outer coastal cliff areas. I did manage to see one more species of shorebird, and this is a large, very handsome colored one with a cinnamon wing lining the marbled godwit. We do have a number of gulls that frequent the area, particularly in the winter time. This one does not nest in the area, and it may be fairly recognizable to a lot of people as they frequent parking lots in shopping centers, in addition to more wild habitats. Fairly easy one to identify, the ring-billed gull. In addition to the ring-billed gull, I saw several larger gulls, ones that nest here along the coast, and that would be the western gull. And I was quite pleased to see a less common species of gull that nests from central Oregon all the way up to south central Alaska, and that is, or was, the glaucous wing gull. We won't get into gulls too much more because that might cause some folks to glaze over, but particularly in the wintertime, we do have a large variety of gulls that take advantage of these different habitats. We do have a tern, actually a very large tern. It's the largest tern in the world, and it occurs on all the different continents in the world. And that's the Caspian Tern. It's another species that nests on different islands in San Francisco Bay, but it's a pretty simple matter for them just to fly over to the western side of Marin County, where they spend time in our coastal estuaries, such as Tomales Bay. And I did see several Caspian terns flying over the bay. It's very difficult to assess the number of fish in the bay or the number of invertebrates like shrimp. So each winter, biologists do a very meticulous count, actually several counts of the number of waterbirds in the bay. And that way we know that there are over 25,000 ducks and grebes and loons and cormorants that spend the winter taking advantage of the very rich food resources in this area. So that's an important monitoring activity, as well as some of the other bird counts that we do have in the area. But again, it seemed like most of the waterfowl had left the area. One of the more abundant ones that we do see, although it seems that the numbers have been declining more recently, is the greater scaup. Scaup are found in San Francisco Bay as well. And the male greater scaup is quite a handsome duck with its, and can be told from another species of scaup by its evenly rounded head. Well, as I moved on and I was running out of time, I was very happy to see another raptor, and that was an osprey. We do have a healthy population of osprey in the area. There are about a dozen nests of osprey around Tomales Bay, and an even greater number in a couple of reservoirs further inland. And that number seems to be declining the last few years, primarily due to the increase of another raptor. And that raptor is our national symbol, of course, the bald eagle. And it's a little bit of a mystery. There were no bald eagles nesting in the area 50 or 100 years ago, but they started nesting about, I want to say 10 or 12 years ago in the area here, and each year we see more and more. So it will be interesting to see what happens to our population of osprey, because the bald eagles do harass them and make their life a little bit more hard. So our national symbol acts a bit like a pirate or a bully, which isn't the nicest thing, but that's somewhat of a reality. So as I got to the end here, I realized there were a few other birds that I hadn't seen that day, but that's okay. The point of this adventure was not necessarily to find every single bird in the area, but to enjoy being out in these wonderful habitats for the most part of the day, to enjoy Earth Day and to enjoy being out and experiencing spring migration. My total for the day was 91 species. And of those 91 species, about 70 species were what are considered to be permanent residents of the area. And about 3/4 of the remainder were spring migrants that have been arriving the last few weeks or couple of months to nest in the area here. Point Reyes is a famous migration spot in different times of the year, or particularly different weather patterns, particularly in fall migration. A lot of bird watchers will visit the outer point here near the Chimney Rock area or near the lighthouse, as in the further portion of this photograph. Unfortunately, this area we don't have access to this area now during the shutdown, shelter in place, but we certainly all are looking forward to when our parks are reopened. I'll thank my wife Patty for supplying this wonderful photograph of the outer point headlands, and as well as all her technical assistants, which made this presentation a whole lot better. So birds, in addition to having these tremendously long migrations, also have amazing abilities to navigate, to move from one area to a specific area quite often to the exact same location where they were nesting the previous year. So they have different skills or different adaptations that allow them to navigate, to stay on a specific course. They can use the stars to navigate because a lot of these birds are moving at night. And also the sun's position, by knowing where they are geographically and knowing the sun's position, they can keep moving on a specific course, as well as even when it's overcast, they can detect the sun by detecting a plane of polarized light. And some birds actually have magnetite in their skull, little bits of magnetite, and that allows them to use a magnetic compass to aid in directing their navigation. So we're blessed with having the wonders of bird migration, and which we get to see at least a couple of times a year here. And I know wherever you folks live, you get to see birds migrating and showing up in a different local park or place where you visit regularly. When I'm teaching birding classes, I often encourage people to visit a favorite local park often, whether it's once a week or even more often than that. And that way you'll be able to see bird migration in action or learn those birds. And if anything happens to those bird populations, you can help monitor them and sound the alarm, as Rachel Carson did with changing bird populations. So that's the end of my presentation. And if there are any questions and answers, I'd be glad to answer them.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we do have a few questions that people have posed here. So if you don't mind taking a few minutes to answer some questions, that'd be great.
You got plenty of time. I'm not going anywhere.
All right, the first one. Have you seen more birds than usual during the pandemic?
You know, I know that's a question that somebody presented to me a few days ago, and I'm gonna have to say no, but that's, I think, primarily a product that I am in a location here in the western part of Marin County where we have a lot of landforms protected and open habitat between the parklands and agriculture areas zoned for protection. Even in a quote average year, we have very large thriving bird populations. But I believe, I'm sure if somebody were posed that question closer to the cities or suburbs, they may well have a different answer. And certainly with fewer of us driving our cars on the highways, I know the air is a lot cleaner and there are fewer disturbances. So I'm sure in some areas, there probably are wildlife populations. I've heard of coyotes being seen more frequently in San Francisco, or I don't know, maybe I even heard something about one in Central Park in New York, but that might be a slightly different story. But I'm sure some of our wildlife populations really are responding. I've heard about bears in Yosemite that are coming out much more frequently as that park has been closed. Yeah, so there are some positive impacts from our changing habitats in the shelter in place.
Great. The next one's more of a compliment. Thanks for your very diverse presentation. The photographs of birds as well as the locations are terrific. The narrative and anecdotes are great too.
Thank you.
All right. So the next question is, where is the double crest on a double crested cormorant?
Good. I'm glad you actually asked that because unfortunately sometimes birds are named for difficult to see field marks or plumages. And that picture, the close-up, I did not have, but for about a month or a month and a half, the cormorants grow groups of feathers above their eyes. Here in the West, they actually are white, and in the eastern part of the country, they're black. So they have a distinctive field mark, but only for a very short period of time. And unfortunately, a couple hundred years ago, when scientists were naming birds like Audubon or Alexander Wilson or others, of course, typically what they did was to shoot the bird and then they were holding it in their hand and then they could see something very obvious like the crest on the double-crested cormorant or the ring on the neck of a ring-necked duck, which often is very difficult to see in the wild. But I agree, it's difficult to see the crest on the double-crested cormorant. They all in different plumages have a very colorful yellowish bill. So it might be good to rename them the yellow-billed cormorant. We'll see about that.
Great, thank you. Are there more egrets nesting in Point Reyes since they no longer nest at Audubon Canyon Ranch?
Yeah, that's a good question. It sounds like maybe it's one of our locals, and for some of you further afield. On the shore of an amazing wetland area called Bolinas Lagoon, which is just north of the town of Stinson Beach, the Audubon Society and one of our heroes, Marty Griffith, who's going to be 100 years old, I think, in a few months, were very instrumental in protecting this Redwood Canyon going back to the mid-1960s. There was a fairly large population of egrets and herons nesting in that one canyon. I believe about 60 nests of great egret and about a dozen or so nests of great blue herons. And about 5 or 6 years ago, they suddenly stopped nesting there. There was some speculation that maybe some eagles had moved in or some raccoons became more adept at climbing up the trees. A number of them started nesting in the trees above Smiley's Tavern in the town of Bolinas across the lagoon. And it is quite possible that some of them have been nesting up here around Tomales Bay. I have not heard from the scientists who are actually doing the monitoring process. There is a whole active program of monitoring heron and egret nests throughout the whole Bay Area. And they certainly would be the ones that could give you that specific answer, whether there has been an increase in nesting here around Tomales Bay. That's a great question.
Great. You know what, someone, okay. You know what? Someone had a question and then it just got deleted. Okay.
If you don't hear your question, maybe you can type in again, and hopefully we can still get around to it.
A question was, what does David use to videotape and record birds?
You know, I can't say that I've done a lot of videoing of birds. Mostly I'm taking still photographs with my digital single lens reflex camera, which can actually be a very good platform for video. So all the video that I used on this presentation, I took off different internet sites.
Great. Another was a compliment. Bravo, David. Absolutely fascinating, just delightful. And thank you.
Thank you.
Second to last slide. Please tell us the names of the birds, the second to last slide.
Let's see if we can go back here. Okay, I assume you can see that on the screen. We have to go to the share here. Well, I'm going to just tell you what the birds were, even if you can't see them on your screen. The upper left one is the green heron, and that's a moderately uncommon bird that we do have a bit in the Point Reyes area. It's another bird that tends to be more common around San Francisco Bay. The upper right one, again, I'm apologizing that we're not drawing this up on your screen. The upper right one is a black-crowned night heron. And I'll tell you the truth, I photographed that black-crowned night heron at a park on the side of Lake Merritt in Oakland. So this is something that we as naturalists or photographers maybe do, is that we don't necessarily, we have an image of a bird that we took in some other location and we'll use it on the presentation that could be of a different geographic area. On the bottom is a breeding plumaged eared grebe. In the middle, of course, this large pelican with 9-foot wingspan would be the American white pelican. And then on the far right is a breeding plumage ruddy duck. The males have that very distinctive ruddy red color with a bright blue bill. And there should be some out in Tomales Bay right now, but somehow that one managed to elude me the other day.
Do you feel the shutdown has been positive for the birds?
Well, that was alluding to a question we had before. If people are not visiting habitats and if their presence in certain habitats, if people went to marshes or beaches that are now sequestered and closed, it's possible that that shutdown could have that beneficial impact of having less impact on those birds. But I think in most protected habitats, people are kept at a fairly good distance from nesting wildlife, so that I would not agree in general that the shutdown has had a beneficial impact on birds.
What's your favorite birding spot in the park, dare you say?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. But I'm going to have to say the Chimney Rock area, which is out near the lighthouse. And I know I was supposed to teach a class out there a week from today, which unfortunately, of course, had to be canceled because we have the nesting seabirds out there, like the common murres, and we have black oyster catchers that frequent the rocky shores. And this time of year, we would have large numbers of Pacific loons migrating by the area, and scoters and brant and grebes, and the great horned owls that are occasionally in the trees. And of course, in fall migration, that can be a site where some of the migrant warblers and other land birds frequent the area, plus migrating gray whales nearby, occasionally humpback whales and other season. You get the idea that it's a very rich, incredible area.
Okay. I haven't seen any kingfishers around Richardson Bay in Mill Valley for several years now. Has their decline been noted, or are you aware of it?
I'm not aware of decline of kingfishers in Mill Valley. I can't say that I spend enough time there. That is what we call anecdotal information, and you may well be right that there is a decline of that species in that particular area. But what we try to do as bird biologists or people interested in managing habitats is have very quantifiable counts of birds. We do something specifically called a count or bird count, which would mean that you would go to a particular area, and if it was nesting small birds, particularly in the nesting season from mid-April through late June, you would simply count what birds are in that area for 5 minutes. 5 minutes is a pretty good chunk of time. You might just try sitting somewhere and being quiet, maybe even meditating the beginning part of our day for 5 minutes. But write down all the birds that you're hearing or seeing for 5 minutes. Go 200 yards, do that again. Maybe do that for 10 stations in a particular spot. Do that let's say three times in that time period until late June. Then you'd have a pretty good quantifiable idea of what birds are in the area. And if you were to repeat that every year for 10 years, then you'd have a very good idea of any declines or increases of bird population. So I'll have to find out, maybe if you wanted to leave your name or something, if there's something specifically happening to kingfishers, what part of the marsh, if it's near the area where people are walking their dogs, potentially that could be an area where there could be some disturbance to them, or further afield down towards Sausalito along the bike path there.
A lot of people keep asking about recordings, and I just want to answer all of them at once, that they will be posted on the EAC website, and I'm not sure, I don't think it's going to be today, obviously, but keep your eyes posted. The entire webinar will be posted online as it's being recorded right now. So someone wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on the Was it the habitat? Hold on, I lost it. Let me go to another question. There were only a few, and now everybody's jumping in.
That's great.
Okay. What's a book you would recommend for bird lovers?
Well, I would recommend a field guide. So in other words, when I started looking at birds in the mid-1970s, it was exciting because not that many people were doing it. And it's something that you only need a pair of binoculars and a field guide to help you to get out and enjoy doing it. So I use the National Geographic field guide. There are several other good ones. The one by David Sibley, Peterson one as well. And then there are a huge number of books on birds, and there's a huge number of websites. So you can certainly learn a lot just going to those different resources. But I would, by all means, recommend more than anything else is going out with a group like your local Audubon Society, and that's going to increase your learning curve exponentially to get out with people as well.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the habitats of woodpeckers?
Well, woodpeckers.
Sorry, habits, not habitats.
The habits of woodpeckers. Well, woodpeckers are certainly very fascinating birds that make their living by feeding primarily on adult or decaying insects in wood, primarily trees. And so they have many different adaptations to aid them in those behaviors. If you remember the woodpeckers that I showed earlier in the presentation, they use their tail like a third leg, so they're propped up. And they have a very stout bill, which acts like a chisel. And possibly even one of their greatest adaptations is their tongue that starts on the back of their skull. Not sure people can see me still, but goes over the top of their skull and then comes out their bill. So when they're feeding, they can actually move their tongue out of their bill, and their tongue has barbs, somewhat like a fishing hook. And that is a tremendous adaptation that allows woodpeckers to slurp up different insect or insect larvae in decaying wood where they're feeding. So they're amazingly well adapted for feeding on decaying wood primarily. And wherever you go, different parts of the world, or most parts of the world, we were recently on a trip on the island of Madagascar in Africa. There are no woodpeckers there, and I happen to know there are no woodpeckers in Australia as well. But in most parts of the world, there are different woodpeckers, and it adds to our fascinating appreciation of bird life if you travel.
Okay, what species are you most worried about declining, and why?
I think about that. Well, some of our songbirds that are being impacted by declining food, so that, or wetlands birds like rails that we don't hear as much as we used to. I had a photograph of the American kestrel in the presentation. We were fortunate that a lot of our raptor populations actually have increased due to habitat protection and captive breeding programs, so that we see more peregrine falcons now and more bald eagles and more osprey than 20 or 30 years ago. The small species of falcon, the American kestrel, has been declining, ironically, possibly because of the increasing numbers of peregrine falcons, or another raptor, the Cooper's hawk, that probably preys on kestrel. But basically, as far as populations declining, a lot of our songbirds that do spend the winter in the tropics of Central and South America, where there's tremendous habitat destruction, which means that the birds are not surviving down in the tropics to return to their breeding regions in North America, and also our boreal forest in Canada, which stretches from eastern Canada across to Alaska, that habitat is being destroyed at an alarming rate. And so that means that our population of warblers, we had a wonderful presentation on using shade-grown coffee so that when the birds do spend the winter in habitats in Central and South America, at least in some places, their habitat is not destroyed. And particularly a bird like the cerulean warbler has a difficult time down there, and it's a lot of the birds, particularly those neotropical migrants, are only at about a third of their populations have declined in the last 30 or 40 years, the research has shown. So that's certainly very, very distressing.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of accolades of great thing. What kind of scope do you use and recommend for a first purchase?
A purchase of optical equipment, whether it's binoculars or scopes, the first limitation is going to be cost. You can get a pretty good pair of binoculars around $300 or $350, or all the way up to over $2,000. With scopes, the less expensive scopes, you're not going to be doing as well, and you may have to spend a little bit more in the money. Whether you want to go all the way up to a Swarovski scope, Koa makes one in a less expensive price range. But that's another, there are two different websites where you could get a lot of information on optical equipment. One is called Optics, the number 4 birding, Optics for Birding, or another one is a store based up in Mendocino, simply called Out of This World. And those are very good resources. Either one of those have a good website, but it's difficult for me to recommend a specific scope in the less. I know Celestron has one. It's difficult just to pick out one scope without comparing to others when you're about to buy one.
Okay, a couple people chimed in here with their advice about birds, and someone said Kingbird Highway, and then the other one is Genius of Birds.
Okay, well, certainly Kingbird Highway is a book that was written by our keynote speaker, Ken Kaufman, who we were very pleased to have speaking at our 10th Point Reyes Birding Festival last year. And so Kingbird Highway is the wonderful story that Ken Kaufman wrote about his travels when he was a teenager back, I believe, in the early 1970s, traveling around the country long before the internet, long before a lot of other modern advances or ease of jet travel to different parts of the country. But it was his story of traveling to different parts of the country in order to see a large number of birds in one particular year. So it's a very readable, enjoyable book. And the other one, The Genius of Birds, I believe, by Diane Ackerman, very well written as well, and many, many others that are just not coming to mind right now.
Okay. Another bird recommendation, someone put red tails in love and the big year.
The Big Year was first a book written by about 3, I'm trying to use the word aggressive and opportunistic birders who traveled around the country to amass a total of birds seen in 1 year is possible, and it was later made into a movie. So that was a fun one. The movie is worth seeing, even though it took a few liberties. Red Tails in Love is a wonderful book that was written about the first successful nesting occurrence or attempt by red-tailed hawk in New York City, specifically on a balcony overlooking Central Park. And I believe that occurred back in the mid or late 1990s. And my niece, Vicki Finkel, who leads walks in Central Park, told me about the larger number of raptors that are now being seen in not just Central Park, but other parks in New York City. So again, that's evidence of increased nesting for raptors in different parts of the country. But yeah, the book goes into not just the red-tailed hawks, but a variety of other birds in Central Park. If you haven't, and a lot of people visit Central New York City, but if you happen to be there the first 10 days or so of May or late April, and you're a bird watcher, by all means visit the park, particularly the Ramble, the middle part of the park where you can be blessed. I was there one day back in the late 1970s and saw dozens and dozens of different species of birds, including 26 species of warbler. Okay, my next one.
There's well, I think this might be the last one. I saw a bald eagle chasing an osprey at Chicken Ranch Beach a few weeks ago. Do they breed locally or do they just passing through?
Yeah, so the bald eagle has started nesting in the area roughly, I want to say about 10 or 12 years ago. Even though we have wonderful habitats here with a lot of birds nesting for different reasons that I'm not totally aware of, bald eagles were not nesting in the area 50 or even 100 years ago. But bald eagles started nesting in some tall trees at Alpine Lake, which of course is upstream on Lagunitas Creek from Samuel P. Taylor State Park. And they, as their numbers of continue to expand in the area, I've heard about 1 or 2 nests on Inverness Ridge, and there's also a nest that has intermittently been occupied at the mouth of Walker Creek on Tomales Bay, not too far from Nick's Cove. So again, this is going to be a very interesting phenomena. Benjamin Franklin was not in favor of the bald eagle to be chosen as our national symbol because he was aware that they are scavengers and act a lot like bullies, and he thought that the turkey would have been a much better bird. But we do have an increasing population of bald eagle in the area, and as the young birds mature and are old enough to nest themselves, it would be very, very interesting to note how many begin to nest in the area, and then of course what does happen to the population of osprey. I know there are more osprey nesting in different places around San Francisco Bay, such as Vallejo there, the mouth of the Napa River. So it's possible some of our birds are leaving, some of our osprey are leaving West Marin and moving over towards San Francisco Bay.
Okay.
So I wanted to thank everybody for the questions, and thank Environmental Action Committee for the opportunity to share my experience of the area.